Our room is now open and I'll let our wonderful moderator take charge.
Just going to note that we're recording the session, if that's okay with everyone.
Okay, so welcome to this fabulous side event, Queer in the COSP, an intersectional and inclusive perspective, LGBTI, persons with a disability and their rights. This side event will be in English with the optional Spanish voice interpretation and also available in closed captions in English and Spanish, as well as international and Mexican Sign Language. If you want to activate Spanish language interpretation, go to the panel at the bottom of the screen, go to the interpretation feature. It has an icon showing a globe and click on Spanish. If you activate this feature, you will always hear meeting in Spanish. This side event is being recorded and will be available online after the event. I would like to acknowledge that I am meeting with you all on the land of Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, Australia. I pay my respects to all First Nations, Aboriginal and Indigenous people and their elders on whose land we are all on today. I would like to take the opportunity and to thank the hosts and the sponsors of this side event: Outright Action International, CREA, ILGA World, REDI, Women Enable International, UN Women, and the Permanent Mission of Finland and Costa Rica to the United Nations. I would also like to acknowledge the groundbreaking and fearless roles of activists at the intersections of LGBTI, or lesbian, gay, and bisexual and intersex, and disability rights are making around the world. As activists, we are challenging the inaccessibility and ableism of queer and LGBTI spaces. We are also challenging homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, interphobia within the disability movement and reframing the advocacy space. In this panel, we will hear from LGBTI people with disabilities and others and their organizations and learn about how they are working, their tactics, their advocacy priorities. I will now ask the Finnish ambassador, Mr. Rahul, for the Permanent Mission of Finland to say a few words of welcome. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And dear colleagues, friends and experts, I would like to thank Outright, CREA, ILGA, REDI, and Women Enable International for organizing this important event and providing my country, Finland, the possibility to co-sponsor and participate. We do it with great pleasure. Rights of persons with disabilities are a cross-cutting priority for us in our foreign and development policies. LGBTI rights are also highlighted in our human rights policy. For example, Finland provides funding to several international NGOs on both themes, as well as to the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities and the independent sexual orientation and gender identity expert. We have participated actively at the annual COSP meeting already for years. One aspect that has not received so much attention in the past COSP meetings, at least not in a very thorough manner, is the intersection of the rights of persons with disabilities and LGBTI rights. We know that both LGBTI persons and persons with disabilities face discrimination, even violence in their everyday lives. This is the case in most countries. Not even my own country is free from discrimination against minorities and persons with disabilities. The ongoing pandemic has, according to numerous research, deteriorated the situation of both groups. Inequalities that already existed before the pandemic have deepened. In the worst situation are persons that are at risk on multiple grounds, such as LGBTI girls and women with disabilities, or LGBTI persons with disabilities that belong to various ethnic or religious minorities. It is therefore crucial to continue to explore ways to fight multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and ensure that rights of all persons are not just respected, but actively promoted, protected, and fulfilled. This event will provide an excellent opportunity for us to listen to experts, exchange information, discuss and deepen our understanding on these issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Now we'll hand it over to the ambassador from Costa, which is Anna. Over to you, please.
Oh, thank you very much. I will pass to Spanish. Agradezco mucho esta invitación para participar en un espacio en el que me siento profundamente identificada. Mi vida la he dedicado a la defensa y promoción de los derechos humanos desde diferentes lugares, pero siempre con una sola convicción: buscar para todos y todas la igualdad y la dignidad sin distinción alguna. Me encontré con la discapacidad hace ya casi 32 años. Esto fue por la maternidad, cuando nació mi hija menor con síndrome de Down, y empecé esta aventura de una vida de lucha en la búsqueda de las reivindicaciones para su reconocimiento, su derecho a la igualdad, a la educación inclusiva, a la salud, incluyendo la sexual y la reproductiva, y en esa lucha yo misma tuve que ir aprendiendo cómo ser una persona plena. En este proceso también ingresé a la vida más política para tratar de estar en el lugar que creía que podía mejorar e incidir para lograr oportunidades para las personas con discapacidad, pero también encontré que en el camino había muchas más personas y grupos que requerían que apoyáramos para tratar de alcanzar su reconocimiento e igualdad. He abrazado desde entonces a la población LGTBIQ y han sido mis amigos, han sido mis aliados y compañeros de lucha en un camino nada sencillo desde la gestión pública, donde hemos y nos hemos abrazado e incluso llorado juntos cuando las puertas se cierran y parecía que no había otra salida, pero siempre nos levantamos. Por eso, hace 6 años, Costa Rica me dio la oportunidad de servirle desde la vicepresidencia de la República y construí un equipo con una diversidad de personas profesionales que tenían en sus realidades la más variada diversidad: mujeres, hombres LGTBI, mujeres y hombres queer, personas afrodescendientes, una mayoría de mujeres definitivamente y muchas mujeres que como feminista me sentía en el deber de traer a mi gabinete. Y sabían desde la vivencia cómo se siente, cómo se vive la desigualdad y la discriminación. Y con ellas y ellos empezamos la construcción de acciones de maneras estrechas y articuladas con la sociedad civil, y mi despacho fue una casa abierta para todas las personas. Trabajamos primero en un pacto por un país más accesible e inclusivo, que reconoció las situaciones de mayor exclusión que enfrentaban las mujeres con discapacidad, las personas indígenas con discapacidad y las personas con discapacidad del colectivo de la diversidad sexual. Este pacto estuvo basado en una cantidad importante de legislación en la materia de derechos humanos de las personas con discapacidad. Además, avanzamos con un decreto sobre no discriminación sobre las personas LGTBIQ en las instituciones públicas. Pero luego, cuando tratamos de avanzar en materia de derechos de la población de diversidad sexual, nos enfrentamos frente a un Congreso de la República, es decir, a una asamblea legislativa cerrada, cargada de estereotipos y sin ninguna posibilidad de hacer avances en legislación. Esa dificultad no era exclusiva de Costa Rica, y valorando ante todo que no se podía seguir en una lucha interminable sin respuestas concretas, trabajamos en la construcción de una consulta a la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos que hicimos en el año 2016 para que se reconocieran los derechos de la convivencia de las parejas del mismo sexo y la identidad de género. La realidad de las intersectorialidades que tenemos las personas es más evidente y compleja en quienes enfrentan la discriminación y no viven por igual, como son todas las personas LGTBI, ni tampoco todas las personas con discapacidad tenían los mismos derechos. Por eso trabajamos en el derecho a la atención ginecológica para mujeres con discapacidad, para hombres trans, en la atención médica respetuosa y adecuada para las mujeres trans también. Pese a todo eso, es necesario reconocer que las personas con discapacidad del colectivo LGTBI aún hoy invisibilizadas, porque es de reconocer que la discapacidad en general niega el reconocimiento a la misma sexualidad y en muchas son excluidas de programas de educación sexual. Pero en el año 2016 recién logramos que las niñas, niños y adolescentes con discapacidad fueran consideradas en las guías de sexualidad como parte del Ministerio de Educación Pública en Costa Rica. Entonces la lucha por el reconocimiento de la orientación sexual, la identidad de género, la expresión de género y las características sexuales en la población con discapacidad es un desafío que tenemos que ser muy fuertes para romper el mito y pasar a la acción. Es urgente y necesario un reconocimiento dentro de los mismos movimientos de la sociedad civil, queer y de discapacidad, cuyas agendas por lo general no se coordinan, pero sabemos que es posible lograr alianzas estratégicas. Les comparto que en Costa Rica hicimos una alianza con Invisibles de personas LGTBI, así se llamaba el movimiento, y el Movimiento de Vida Independiente, y realizaron una marcha para pedir acción conjunta ante la Asamblea Legislativa, interactuando entre los colectivos por primera vez. Finalmente quisiera compartir muy rápido algunos de los avances que hemos conseguido. En el año 2016 aprobamos, después de 9 años de discusiones, que la Asamblea Legislativa eliminara las restricciones de capacidad jurídica de las personas con discapacidad, más conocida como Ley de Autonomía, que me había permitido yo presentar como diputada hacía muchos años ya para alcanzar lo que la Convención de Discapacidad nos pedía. En el año 2017, uno de los actos menos conocidos en el mundo, pero que más me llevó de satisfacción, cerramos para siempre la parte de permanencia y vida institucionalizada en el Hospital Nacional Psiquiátrico, en donde sabíamos que había muchas personas que estaban consideradas con enfermedad psiquiátrica por su orientación sexual. También los programas de protección a la población con discapacidad en riesgo social, pobreza o abandono, se otorgó un pleno reconocimiento y un trato igualitario a las personas LGTBI que requieren de los mismos servicios y programas de apoyos en manutención, en salud, a parejas de personas con discapacidad en situaciones de riesgo o vulnerabilidad, también perteneciendo al colectivo. En la seguridad social se reconoce el derecho a la persona asegurada para que la pareja LGTBI pueda no solo ser parte de seguridad social y ser atendido médicamente, sino en caso de muerte dejar una pensión a su cónyuge o conviviente. Costa Rica reconoce el derecho al matrimonio igualitario de toda persona y eliminó la restricción del matrimonio de personas con discapacidad. Esta decisión fue tomada por la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos y trasciende a todos los países que son parte de la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos, y yo me permití suscribir la consulta. Costa Rica también decretó hacer la primera encuesta nacional sobre discapacidad y se empezó a trabajar con datos sólidos en el tema de género, violencia de género, derechos sexuales y reproductivos, discriminación por orientación sexual e identidad de género. Aún los datos requieren mayor profundidad, pero se tiene una base para la programación y la acción. De todas las personas, independientemente de las situaciones, realidades y características, tienen los mismos derechos humanos porque pertenecemos a la raza humana. Y es tiempo de exigir ese cumplimiento pleno, de realmente seguir desde los estados, no solo debatiendo, sino llegando a las acciones. Muchísimas gracias por el espacio. Siempre estaremos a las órdenes para levantar la voz en favor de los derechos humanos, muy especialmente en aquellos invisibilizados. Gracias.
So thank you both for your official welcome to this side event, and I hope you enjoy other side events over the next couple of days. Now on to the next part of the actual side event. I'm going to set the scene for the panel discussion. So I'm just going to spend the next 5 minutes just highlighting some few things. In all corners of the world, lesbians, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex, or better known as LGBTI, people with disabilities experience discrimination and exclusion not only based on our sexual orientation, but also gender identity, gender expression, and sexual and sex characteristics, or SOGIESC as we will refer to it today, but also on the basis of our disability. Moreover, other than non-exhaustive layers of diversity, such as our gender, Aboriginal, ethnicity, race, age, human rights, activism, migration, class, economic status, also determines the extent of which we as LGBTI people with disabilities can enjoy and exercise our human rights. At COSP 11 in New York in 2018, I had the pleasure of being a panel member of the side event hosted by People with Disabilities Australia for disabled people's organisations titled LGBTI, People with Disabilities and Implementation of the CRPD. This was the very first ever Pacific LGBTI CRPD side event. The event explored the intersections between disability and sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, and the emerging response of the committees of the rights of people with disabilities to these intersections and the role of the state parties in ensuring that LGBTI people with disabilities are not left behind. The side event was extremely well received by delegates of COSP 11, and there were calls from the floor for better international collaboration and coordination to progress the rights of LGBTI people with disabilities globally. We can see that issues affecting LGBTI people worldwide are increasingly being considered by the United Nations rights bodies. One of our hosts today, the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association, better known as ILGA World, is doing a fantastic and important work tracking and publishing reports on treaty bodies and engagement with such issues, including LGBTI specific questions and concluding observations on the CRPD committee. In 2019 alone, 9 UN treaty bodies made 137 references to sexual orientation, gender, identity expression, and sexual characteristics. In 66 observations, recommendations to 56 member states. This impressive shift to a focus on human rights issues that we are facing, that what we're facing is a direct result of us, all of us, the grassroots LGBTI activists with disabilities speaking up, mobilizing, activating, and agitating. Contribution made by UN treaty bodies does help bring change on the ground. In November 2018, for example, the Human Rights Committee made urgent recommendations to regarding restricting the death penalty, which include imposed on the grounds of torture. In July 2020, abolished the death penalty for consensual same-sex sexual acts, months before the report of the committee on the issue was due. So it does create really good change. But let's talk a little bit about some of the significant markers of progress that I've witnessed, and I'm sure most of you have. The CRPD Committee General Comment Number 7, published the 9th of November 2018, was a very significant document. International Disability Alliance, better known as ILGA, board ratified a position paper at the board meeting to say that they will include work on LGBTI lens in their work. ILGA World reports on the CRPD committee work relating to issues covering 19, 20, and 21 sessions. But more importantly, people with disabilities are establishing networks for LGBTI people with disabilities in a number of regions around the world. I just want to make a mention to the Little People of America that recently established the Rainbow Committee, first time organization out of the short stature community to do so. Also, activists from East Africa, South Asia, South America, and beyond are doing some amazing work on the ground in their regions. And we'll hear a little bit more about that later. Women Enabled International is doing an important job of addressing non-binary and trans activist work in their work, much needed work. Increasing global research activities relating to LGBTI people with disabilities, including the everyday experience of LGBTIQ people living with disabilities. This was actually conducted by La Trobe University here in Australia, and also did a review of what was happening internationally. Just only a month ago, the Private Life 3, a national survey of health and well-being of LGBTIQ people living in Australia, was conducted by the La Trobe University. This report actually has a chapter on the issues of LGBTI people with disability. Also, at ILGA World Conference 2019 in Wellington, New Zealand, a panel on intersectionality with disability was highlighted, was actually on the agenda for the first time. Just last month, ILGA Oceania, a region of ILGA World, added a disability subcommittee to their board and the constitution. I, very proudly, was appointed as the chairperson of this subcommittee. And just to finish off the markers, in 2021, ILGA World will have a project on the UN advocacy for LGBTI people with disabilities. Now we are going to hear from our wonderful LGBTI activists and panel members from around the world about advocacy and research that they have been doing and change that they have achieved for themselves and others. I will be doing one-on-one interviews with each panelist, and the opportunities for questions and answers they have all spoken. There will be a QA at the end, where you can then post questions on the chat. Our first panelist is Dr. M Morgan Holmes. Welcome. Dr. Morgan Holmes is a Canadian sociologist, author, and professor at Wilfrid University in Canada. Dr. Holmes is also an intersex activist and writer. Dr. Holmes participated in the first public demonstration by intersex people, now marked as Intersex Awareness Day. Dr. Holmes' academic interests include sexuality, queer theory, and has an interest in intersex issues to other forms of bodily diversity, including disability. So welcome, Morgan Holmes. Some questions. Can you tell us about yourself and the work that you've done on intersex? You're on mute, Morgan. Morgan, you need to unmute yourself.
There it is.
Lovely, thank you.
My apologies, my windows were not working properly. So let me start by thanking the side panel for the invitation. It is my pleasure to be here this morning. Can I tell you a little bit about my work? I started 26, almost 27 years ago as a researcher who very quickly became an activist at the same time. Some of that was the luxury of being a grad student who was already working in areas recognized as the beginnings of queer theory. And so I really felt that where many of my peers were in danger in terms of their workplaces, in terms of their social environs, that I would not be in danger by exposing myself. And so when I was called to become this sort of public face of very, very early intersex activism in 1993-94, I said, yes, sure. I then really got burnt out very quickly, and it was shortly after the Boston demonstration in 1996 that I sort of went to ground. So the work then became very much research focused, and I moved from thinking about intersex in sort of pure queer theory and LGBT rights to thinking about it in terms of disability and its imbrication within disability frameworks, the pathologization frameworks of typical medicine. So that's sort of the arc of the career. I no longer think of intersex as something that we can conceive of outside of its constitution as a medical and pathologized category. When I started 26, 27 years ago, I was very insistent that intersex could be its own thing. But I no longer think that.
Morgan, do you want to continue?
I'm getting audio coming back at me, so I'm not sure what else you would like to know, and as far as that first question goes, I'm sorry.
I do apologize about the audio before. So let's move on to the second question. What does the disability right concept mean for you?
Sure. So I really started to think about intersex in relation to disability toward the end of the 90s. And it was through the enhancement technologies program at McGill University, which was at the time headed by Margaret Somerville and Carl Elliott. Carl Elliott has gone on to the University of Minnesota as the head of bioethics there. And that framework allowed me to start to think about the rationalizations of medicine for the way that it treats intersex. And it treats intersex always already as a pathology. There's no other framework for it. So there are two basic categories for medical intervention, and one is enhancement, in which we are supposedly made better than we would be expected to be normally. And enhancement technologies can include things like cosmetic surgeries to change one's appearance without having a functional complaint about oneself, but they could include things like intelligence enhancements that people sort of fantasize about at this point that haven't become reality, but people are, you know, thinking, could we do that, or could we extend life? And so I said, is the typical interference in intersex and enhancement? And I think the obvious answer there is no. I've written about this, that the typical interference is damaging. And in fact, the EU Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Gomez, in 2013, determined that the typical way of approaching intersex in medical frameworks constitutes a form of medical torture. So it's not enhancement. Is it a restoration though? Because that's the other dynamic. And all of our healthcare policy, where there is insurance to pay for these extraordinarily expensive interventions, uses the premise that this is the restoration of an expected function. So then really what we're talking about is a view of a certain kind of body, and that body is variable. There's no definite intersex body out there that I could say, oh, that's the one, right? There's no objective category. There's a body that a physician or a surgeon finds disgusting upon his or her own apprehension of that body as such, and says, oh, nobody will ever want to have sex with that body, it's too ugly. And so that body is constituted as a kind of socially invalid, disabled body, always already from the outset. So what I want to say is that the framework for this panel asked for, or set 4 priorities that assume a sexuality here and a disability in addition to it. And this is not how intersex works. Intersex is itself imbricated in a disability framework of pathology imposed, right? This is the very traditional sense of the social construction of disability. And then what happens, what I've argued over the arc of my career, is that the interventions are themselves actually physically and emotionally and psychologically disabling. So I've shifted my position, really, as I was saying, from thinking that intersex was a thing that we could ultimately wrest from medicine and liberate in the same way that we were seeing lesbian and gay identities, and I'm talking about in the 90s, being liberated from a pathological framework. But I actually don't think that intersex is anything more than the constitution now, or the imposition of a fantasy category on a particular child's body. And then with that come a whole series of rights violations. So there are efforts in different areas. There have been these kinds of efforts to wrest the idea of intersex from its pathologization, from its stigmatization, by creating other terms. And I think DSD is probably among the worst. It was created out of a conference in 2005, published in 2006 as the new sort of normative guideline, but it is premised on the idea that there is a disorder. And it appealed greatly to families, it appealed to clinicians, because they were sort of able to say, oh, this is a neutral disorder like anything else, and we will fix or we will cure. But what we're finding is that that imposition, as if the word disorder weren't already stigmatizing enough, which was sort of the immediate response of activists around the world, that it's actually very, very dangerous. So the idea of a disorder is promoting prenatal interventions leading toward greater and greater termination of anything that we can identify prenatally. There's very early stage work going on at McGill University by the Center for Genomics and Law, and I'm a collaborator on a grant there. And what they're finding is a repetition of what Adrienne Ash found in the 1990s, that the overwhelming negativity about intersex as a set of bodily possibilities is such that when it was compared hypothetically to other prenatally identified disabilities, the genetics counselors were far more likely to advise termination of an intersex fetus or a fetus so identified than they were for the disabilities that it was compared to. And so I think we're seeing that that is a real problem now that those technologies are actually in place. So AIS, CAH, these are easy to identify prenatally, and we're seeing upwards of 90% terminations because the physicians, the surgeons, the clinicians have sort of thrown their hands up at the refusal of adult intersex to get in line, so to speak. So our refusal becomes an excuse for the elimination of fetuses prenatally. You wouldn't become the normal thing that we wanted out of all of that practice. AIS is androgen insensitivity syndrome, I'm sorry, and CAH is congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So these are enormous terms. They are the most common forms of intersex. Androgen insensitivity very quickly stated, please, like, it's much more nuanced than this, but there is an XY body with chromosomes XY that does not either, in some situations, synthesize testosterone, or in other situations, respond to testosterone. The development of the child is therefore toward the more typically female appearing. And CAH is an adrenal gland function issue in which androgens are produced that cause what is considered to be masculinization on female bodies. CAH can affect male bodies as well, but it doesn't produce, well, it might produce a bigger penis, but nobody complains about that. So those are the categories. And I'm sorry, I don't have an easy translation into Spanish for those. Let me think. C'est l'androgen syndrome d'insensitivité et I'm trying to remember for CAH in French, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking. I'm not a morning person either.
That's fine. Look,
Okay.
look, just hold it there because we're going to come back to you. We've got a couple of other people that we need to do some one-on-one. Fascinating things that you've raised, and I noticed people are putting comments in the chat. So don't disappear. We'll come back to you later on for the Q&A. So thank you for that, Morgan.
Yes. Can I answer people in the chat?
Yes, yes.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I'd like to move on and introduce Lindo X. What? How I do it? L. Brown from USA. So it's a community builder and organizer writer, activist, educator, strategic, lawyer, cultural worker, dreaming of disability justice and collective liberation. Their work focused on addressing ending impersonal, structural, systemic, institutional violence targeting at disabled people at margins of margins. Currently, they are creating art and written offerings for their own tarot deck titled Disability Justice Wisdom Tarot. Should ask him to do a reading. Lena is the Director of Policy, Advocacy and External Affairs for Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. They are non-binary queen and ace and is East Asia, Chinese, American survivor of transnation adoption. Often their most important work in their communities has no title, no job description or funding, or probably never will. So welcome. Can you put your camera on so I can see you?
Good morning, my camera's on. Hi, this is Lydia.
Welcome to this event. Can you talk about gender diversity and sexuality and autism?
Certainly, this is Lydia. The autistic community has known for many years that we are more likely to identify as queer or trans, and likewise that in the trans community, trans people are more likely to be autistic or another form of neurodivergent. And while there are many possible reasons for that, what we've often spoken about in our own communities is the fact that many of us grow up isolated, abused, ostracized, subject to intense discrimination, prejudice, and marginalization, especially on the basis of being disabled. And so if we're already deemed to be a freak or an outsider because of how our brains work and what people perceive about us existing in society, then it's not surprising at all that for many of us, upon realizing that we don't fit into the white Western notion of the gender binary as male and female and to normative ideas about masculinity and femininity, that there's nothing stopping us from claiming these parts of our identities or experiences either. In other words, if we're already seen to be freaks, if we're already seen to be weird in some way, then it can become easier in some ways to accept that how our genders are, just as much as how our brains are, do not fit normative expectations. That if the way our brains work already challenges expectations for how people ought to think and learn and express and communicate and feel and form relations, then it is not that much of a leap to accept that the ways that we experience and express our own genders, our identity, our expression, our relationship to even the idea of gender will not necessarily fit that mold. And so in some ways, to be autistic or otherwise neurodivergent can be a way to make it easier for those of us who are trans to recognize that part of ourselves than it might be for at least some people who are not neurodivergent. But you know, the other thing to talk about when you mention that intersection is that for those of us who live as both trans and autistic, we don't have to deal with just ableism or with just anti-trans oppression, but with what happens when you compound multiple forms of oppression with each other. And we talk about this in the advocacy and the activist world within the framework of intersectionality. But what many people do not understand in talking about intersectionality is the necessity and the vitality of addressing ableism as a core and necessary part of other forms of oppression. And Morgan was just speaking about this now in the context of the medical industrial complex's approach to intersex conditions and the people who are born with intersex conditions. And we understand that pathologization of trans identities, of intersex conditions, and of many other marginalized and oppressed communities happens in a multitude of ways, where this occurs in the context of psychiatrizing dissent and protests and resistance movements, but it also occurs in the context of pathologizing people's bodies and minds, of pathologizing negatively racialized peoples, of Indigenous and First Nations peoples, of Black, Brown, Asian, and Latinx peoples, of pathologizing people who are fat, of pathologizing people whose bodies do not meet conventional notions of attractiveness or aesthetic beauty, of pathologizing people who are queer, who are trans. And this idea of pathologizing people, right, is rooted in ableism, to say that we are wrong, we are burdensome, we are defective, we are diseased, we are broken because of something that is inherently defective about our bodies or our minds. That is an idea that is rooted in ableist logics. And we point this out on the civilizational scale too, that when whole societies, whole nations, and whole cultures are pathologized as backwards, as stupid, as undemocratized, as medieval, usually from a white Western colonial lens, that is also relying on the logic of ableism. So for us to exist in the world as multiply marginalized people, then that means that we have to deal with the brunt of ableism falling on us, both in the most explicit way of pathologizing how our brains work, how our bodies work, but also pathologizing what our genders are, pathologizing even our own understanding of what our gender is. And you see this play out in denial of access to care, denial of access to support, even from within queer and trans communities and activist spaces, and denial of our ability to simply exist as human. An example of that, in the United States, it is very common for many trans autistic people to be told that you cannot access gender-affirming care or support services or medical transitioning unless you find a way to, quote, work on your autism, or in the most crass form of that particular exhortation, that you have to find a cure for your autism before you can be approved to access gender-affirming treatment. And for other people who are disabled, especially with psychosocial disabilities, there's often similar logic. Well, until we can be sure that you identifying as trans is not merely a symptom of a psychosocial disability, then we're not going to approve access to gender-confirming treatment, to other forms of gender-affirming support of any kind. And that is not only damaging, but it can be deadly. That autistic people, on average, die 30 years younger than non-autistic people. And the second leading cause of our death is death by suicide. Another fact, and a way in which this shows up, is in particular the intersection of anti-youth ageism, as well as ableism and anti-trans oppression. We even heard comments from very prominent TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, people who believe in a very particularly awful brand of gender essentialism, that it is apparently horrifying and disturbing that more and more autistic young people are identifying and coming out as trans. And the logic or rationale behind that train of thought is that autistic young people do not understand our own bodies, our own minds, our genders, or our lives. That autistic young people are incapable of understanding who we are, and that being autistic necessarily means that we are incapacitated and incompetent. And that because of that, if autistic young people identify as trans, it is not because we are actually trans, but it is rather that we have been brainwashed or manipulated. And this is gross, awful ableism and denial of agency at the intersection of anti-trans oppression, of anti-youth ageism, and of ableism, that denies us sovereignty over our own bodies, that we're not even able to define for ourselves who we are because of preconceived notions that are supported and that are perpetuated throughout our juridical systems and throughout our social cultural norms, that to be disabled, and particularly to have a mental disability, means that you are incapable of exercising self-determination, of exercising agency, or of having the right to dignity and bodily autonomy. And this falls hardest, of course, on autistic young people who are trans, who are also negatively racialized, who also belong to other marginalized and minoritized communities in whatever country or culture we come from, because we are the least likely to be able to access support, to be able to access resources, and to be recognized as whole humans.
Wow, there's so much in what you've just said. You know, I could spend hours unpacking that. But don't disappear. We have to get on and interview a couple more of the panels. So just hang on to it. Any more thoughts? And if people are putting questions or anything on the chat, save them from the Q&A. So thank you. We'll now move on to the next panel member, which is Rosa, it is from Qatar. I've got dyslexia, folks, so I don't say words properly. It's from Mexico. She is the first deaf student in Mexico to pursue a law degree at the University of Colorado. Defender of her rights, her deaf community, she works in different civil societies organizations to fight for the recognition of the rights for people with disabilities in her state. She currently works for the state attorney office with the inmates, in addition to working as an interpreter in Mexican Sign Language in the legal field. So welcome, Rosa. Your camera on? Is your camera on, Rosa? You're there, Rosa? I can't see your camera. Okay. All good? All good?
¿Listo? ¿Ya me pueden ver? Muy bien. Hola, primeramente quiero agradecerles por la invitación a este foro tan importante. Es la primera vez que a nivel internacional participo. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Como ya lo mencionaron, mi nombre es Rosa Casillas. Este es mi nombre en lengua de señas. Desde mi experiencia, ya lo mencionaron, soy estudiante de Derecho, trabajo dentro del área de comisaría de sentenciados en Secretaría de Seguridad. Y bueno, primeramente quiero mencionarles que soy persona lesbiana, soy parte de la comunidad LGTBI. Y bueno, quiero platicar un poquito sobre mi experiencia personal en cuanto a cómo inició mi reconocimiento como persona perteneciente a la comunidad LGTBI, la reacción de mis padres. De pronto sabemos que es muy difícil para los padres el poder comprender la situación, más siendo una persona con discapacidad. Sí, entonces recuerdo yo que pues siempre tuve mucho gusto por la ropa no tan femenina, y de pronto el jugar con las niñas pues no era como mi interés, siempre era jugar con los niños. Mi hermana y yo jugábamos, por ejemplo, muñecas, Barbies, y yo decía, no, a mí no me gusta jugar Barbies, yo prefería jugar con carritos, jugar fútbol, me fascina el fútbol. Y siempre me decían, mira, es que tú tienes que ser como tu hermana, ¿no? Yo empecé a identificar esta parte dentro de mí que pues me atraían mucho las cosas de los niños, el fútbol, y recuerdo que a veces hasta me quitaban mis cosas en cuanto a la vestimenta, debido a que me decían, no, es que tú debes de vestir femenina, tienes que usar vestido. Y yo, no, mamá, es que el vestido a mí no me gusta. Entonces sí, con el paso del tiempo, llegaron unas vecinas a la casa, una pareja, supongo yo que eran esposas. Yo las veía y siempre se me hacía pues una pareja muy bonita, ¿no? Y dentro de mí yo dije, es que yo también quiero algún día tener una pareja. Entonces yo empecé a platicarlo con mi mamá, tomé el valor y le dije, ¿sabes qué, mamá? Quiero confesarte que yo estoy pues un poquito confundida, me gustan las mujeres. Mi mamá dijo, no, ¿cómo crees que tú con las mujeres? O sea, tú debes de casarte con un hombre. Después de la reacción de mi madre, lo que hice fue reprimir mis emociones ante ella, y empecé yo a tener un gusto por una amiga, la cual era mujer. Entonces reprimía mis sentimientos ante mis padres hasta que pues de una u de otra forma se dieron cuenta, ¿no? Yo dije, la reacción de mi mamá ha sido muy difícil, entonces tuve que hablarlo con mi papá, y ya hasta una edad más adulta fue cuando por fin me acerqué a ellos y les dije, ¿saben qué? No me gustan los hombres, yo prefiero las mujeres, y tras esta situación, pues tuve que irme de la casa, ¿no? Porque pues no aceptaban esta parte mi familia. Actualmente, ahora ya lo conozco, que nuestra Constitución mexicana, las leyes de México, en el artículo número 1, en la fracción número 5, ahí prohíbe todo tipo de discriminación, sin importar la raza, el género, la religión y las preferencias. Esto es algo que está dentro de nuestra Constitución. A mi edad, y poder ver
Thank you for that.
que estas situaciones estaban establecidas en la ley y que es una ley para todas las personas en México, me di cuenta que todas las personas tenemos el derecho a ser iguales, a que tengamos nuestros derechos humanos y que tengamos el derecho a la igualdad. Esto está establecido en nuestra Constitución y es un objetivo importante que se debe de regir en todo ámbito. También parte de mi experiencia personal, recuerdo hace como un semestre o 2 semestres atrás, estaba en una clase con mi intérprete de lengua de señas. Fue un día sábado, lo recuerdo bien, y estábamos hablando sobre el tema del matrimonio en derecho civil. Pero entonces yo le pregunté al maestro, ¿cómo es que si actualmente hay leyes y que 2 mujeres u hombres pueden casarse y adoptar? Y el maestro, yo le pregunté esta situación porque quería saber, porque la verdad me interesa mucho el poder tener una pareja y algún día poder adoptar. Entonces es por ello que le pregunto al maestro y le digo, disculpe maestro, por ejemplo, yo como persona sorda y como persona perteneciente a la comunidad LGTBI+, ¿puedo adoptar? Y el maestro me dijo, perdón, pero eso está prohibido por la ley, no se puede aceptar una situación así en el ámbito jurídico. Entonces, y más por ser una persona con discapacidad, ¿cómo pretendes adoptar? Su comentario me rompió en 1000 pedazos. Dije, o sea, es cierto que soy una persona sorda y aparte no puedo adoptar por ser parte de la comunidad LGTBI. Así que, por ejemplo, si fuesen personas, un hombre y una mujer, sí se les permite adopción, pero a nosotros por ser personas pertenecientes a la comunidad LGTBI no se nos permite adoptar. Y el maestro dijo, no se nos permite, no pueden, está prohibido por la discapacidad y aparte por esta característica. De verdad, este comentario me hizo sentir doblemente discriminada. Aparte de ello, ha habido algunos de mis compañeros dentro de mi salón, los cuales yo he sentido ese rechazo de parte de ellos por ser persona lesbiana y por tener discapacidad auditiva. La verdad ha sido una situación un poquito difícil y estas son situaciones que obviamente te marcan como persona. Además de esto, podemos ver que dentro de cómo es posible que una situación así dentro de una persona profesional, un maestro, permitiera o hiciera esta discriminación, ¿no? Eso es algo pues que aún sigue doliendo. En México, en cuestión de el ámbito de salud, también les quiero comentar desde mi experiencia, en cuestión de salud mental ha sido muy complicado encontrar a personas expertas en el tema. Por ejemplo, hay amigos que pertenecen a la comunidad LGTBI y que de verdad a veces no tienen o no tenemos este acceso a un psicólogo, ¿no? Entonces ha sido una situación complicada porque muchos de ellos ni siquiera pueden exponer a sus familiares las emociones, ¿sí? Por ejemplo, de forma personal yo les quiero platicar cómo es que anteriormente pues fue muy complicado para mí el que mi familia me aceptara como persona perteneciente a la comunidad LGTBI y aparte de ello hubo una persona que abusó de mí. Entonces, sabiendo que yo era lesbiana, esta persona abusa de mí y digo, ¿cómo es posible que existan estas situaciones? Así que tras todo esto, como les comentaba, tuve que salir de casa porque no me sentía a gusto, tenía mucho sufrimiento en cuanto a mi reconocimiento como persona lesbiana. Pensé en suicidarme a causa de esta situación porque se sufre mucha discriminación en muchos ámbitos, o al menos yo lo he padecido. No podía ser una persona libre, independiente por esta presión social. Así que estas situaciones me han llevado o me llevaron en su momento a tener una vida muy difícil. También el hecho de poder expresar a una persona experta en el área de salud mental, la psicología, en cómo tener un acceso adecuado como personas sordas es algo muy complicado. Desde esta fecha hasta la actualidad, solo puedo recordar que es muy complicado para nosotros como personas sordas aperturarnos y explicar por falta de comunicación. Así que debemos de controlar nuestras emociones, vivir con este tipo de rechazos, el sentirnos mal de forma constante. Recuerdo, por ejemplo, son partes de las cosas que hacen falta de nuestros derechos humanos dentro del Estado mexicano, dentro de las leyes, que haya realmente un respeto a los derechos humanos como personas con discapacidad y pertenecientes a la comunidad LGTBI. En cuestiones emocionales, les comento, sufrimos mucha opresión o estamos reprimidos porque en ocasiones a veces los padres no saben que su hijo sordo tiene esta característica, a veces por el miedo, no hay como esta determinación de abrirse ante su familia, al igual que a mí me pasó en mi experiencia. Puedo percatarme de que dentro de la misma comunidad sorda existe esta situación complicada y ha sido un trabajo en el cual queremos como parte de la comunidad seguir trabajando con las familias. Es una lucha constante, la cual pues nos hemos dado cuenta con el tiempo que es muy complicada de poder romper estos estereotipos. El que los sordos puedan expresarse en cuanto a sus preferencias, por ejemplo, en un psicólogo. Recuerdo yo la experiencia de una psicóloga que sabía un poco de lengua de señas. Quería yo expresar lo que sentía de forma confiable y me doy cuenta que ella empieza a difundir la información que yo le había mencionado. No hay ese respeto a la comunidad de guardar el secreto profesional, falta ética de estos profesionales, de los pocos que saben lengua de señas. Entonces sí es una situación muy complicada y lo cual ha llevado a que busquemos otras opciones, otros profesionales, otros psicólogos que atiendan. Lamentablemente son muy escasos los psicólogos que hablan lengua de señas y sobre todo que tienen esta peculiaridad de que realmente sí sean profesionales y guardar el secreto de confidencialidad de su paciente. Así que son situaciones que nos llevan a vivir situaciones muy graves de forma emocional. También en cuestiones de salud se necesita información, desde, por ejemplo, la experiencia en cuanto a la educación sexual. No se tiene esta información para las personas que somos sordas y pertenecemos a la comunidad LGTBI. No hay este acceso de intérpretes, de información, para que podamos tener nosotros acceso a ella requerimos del intérprete y dentro del sector salud no hay estas acciones. Recuerdo recientemente un amigo mío que pertenece a la comunidad gay, también acaba de morir porque se contagió de SIDA. No tenía los recursos de forma particular, a un médico particular pagarlos él, y tampoco tenía acceso a la seguridad social del Estado. Así que él falleció por falta de tratamiento y también su contagio fue a causa de pues falta de información. No había esta información en cuestión de evitar enfermedades de transmisión sexual. Así que ha sido una lucha muy, muy difícil.
Yeah.
Por ejemplo,
Can I interrupt you?
Desde mi
We've got a couple of other panel people that we need to talk to. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Rosa. Now we'll move on to the next panel, which is Paul is a candidate LGBTI rights and social justice activist in East Africa. They have been at the forefront of the struggle for queer and trans liberation. Paul co-developed the first initiatives in support of queer women and intersex, trans and non-binary women in Canada and Uganda. Paul is a genderqueer, social and healing justice advocate guided by love and transformation justice. Paul has over 20 years experience working with civil society as an advocate and teacher of human rights. Welcome. Can you tell us about yourself and the work that you do on the ground in your region?
Yes. Hello. Thank you very much for being here today and for having me. I'm mostly interested in having the conversation around community accountability and transformative justice. I think it's so powerful that the speakers before me have mentioned a lot of the struggles or the ways that justice work we are doing is centered in a lot of violence and in a lot of harm. So I've been working based in East Africa mostly, but quite invested in global politics. The work that I do is community building work, and essentially it is centered in building the capacity to respond and to transform the harm that we experience. I have come into my power as a disabled person because I have always lived in chronic pain and my body has held so much disease, and that has meant that I have lived mostly bound or left out by the ableism that exists within our systems. So in East Africa, actually, I want to acknowledge that even when the LGBTI human rights conversation is so progressive and has gone on to go to court and to have a public space within our news stations and also within our family discussions, we still have a lot of shame and have a lot of bias and prejudice on the issue of disability. A lot of our work is focused on how much your body can be able to achieve, is focused on your productivity level, and thus all or most of the initiatives are held and leadership is given to people in able bodies. So a lot of us people living with disability then have to constantly struggle to locate disability and to locate body politics in such a way that it takes the conversation deeper than what ableism and capitalism tries to elevate as what is normal or what is available. I am very interested also as I grow deeper into my identity and into the community that I work with. I've found that language has given me so much power. The language to identify with my body as is, the language to not run away from my disability or to try to package my disability to be acceptable to other people, but to occupy my body and to elevate my power in my disabled body in such a way that we are talking about liberation work that insists on every body being a human body with integrity, with dignity, with the ability to feel and encompass joy and sadness, and to also participate in building building community, in building capacity to be different and to be more love-centered and to be more love-focused in the work that we do. I'm also interested in speaking through the ways that then this language is used to cluster us. So where a lot of times when people talk about disability, a lot of people will relate to a physical disability. And thus there is space that is created in a conversation when people are asked, so can you climb up a flight of stairs? And in a lot of ways, as someone in a chronic ill body or in pain, there is a lot of work that I have to do to represent myself in this space. If I have to explain to somebody that, yeah, I'll climb a flight of stairs, but at the end of this day, I will spend the next 3 days nursing pain or being immobile in my bed because I had so much investment in participating in this community conversation around my own rights and my own integrity, but that has come at the cost of my body and my wellness. And that in no way in my world is not liberatory, is not giving me the revolution I'm looking for. So I want to talk about the ways in which also we consider disability that comes to us as communities who are heavily dependent on substances, who are heavily identifying with narcotics and substance use. So then we are quite exposed to developmental or psychiatric conditions or mental illnesses. That, coupled with the reality of the laws we live in, the culture that we come from that has language to speak about our existence up until our queerness or our disability shows up, I think it's important for us to name the ways in which our disability is showing up in our lives. It's important for us to also organize in ways that we remove the work from the people who are ridden with this disability. Us who are living with disability don't need to be doing any more work to make people understand what our disability looks like. I need to feel safe and comfortable and thought of when I'm invited to spaces, as much as I need to feel empowered by the work that I am doing in community. I also have a lot of interest when we talk about policies and when we talk about international human rights standards and the UN as it continues to uplift the work of LGBTI people and LGBTI people who are living with disability, youth who are disabled, sex workers who are disabled. What language are we elevating for people to understand that our disability does not remove us from the conversation or does not insist that we then educate people on what access is for us, but that the work we are doing holds access as a conversation around, do we have the finances? Do we have the logistics? Do we have the power to hold people safe so that they can step into their agency? So in this conversation, I am honored that my panelists are so powerful to name and to hold our community in such regard. And I want us to continue discussing ways that within the LGBTI community, that disability is not removed from this LGBTI conversation, but that we center our conversation in responses that respond to the harm that is done to our bodies because of the ways the system is set. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. So one last person for the panel. Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Rahul is an artist, activist, educator, author, working as a consultant to several organizations across the globe in cross-culture, disability, mental health, education through her organization. The Red Door India, some of you may have already heard of it, and had an Inc. fellow, TED speaker. She advocates that creativity is the best tool for psycho-spiritual healing. Welcome to the panel. So can you tell us, how do we best address mental health amongst our community.
Hey everyone, I'm so glad this is happening online, because if this was on the ground, you would see me probably jumping off tables and being completely restless and probably falling asleep on the floor at the same time. So I'm glad this platform is being made available. So the work that we've been doing since 2011 is to really allow people to change the narratives of what mental illness and mental health can mean. And I'm so glad that all the previous speakers have already covered up those points, so that I don't actually have to go over them. Mental health is just one part of the human condition, and mental illness, as we know, comes from somebody deciding that you're mad. Although CRPD has, and we have used the term as psychosocial disability, you know, we can call it rose by any other name, but it still smells like rose. So when from me, let me first introduce how I came to this approach, and why even the term, the red door with the organization, and how it's connected to being queer or LGBTQI and all of this gamut. So although I am based out of India and I've been here for 21 years of my life, I am actually born and brought up in Malaysia. My first instance with a psychiatrist was after I ran away from home. And I was diagnosed as being a transvestite who needed sex change. That being said, I was brought to India in hope that the culture here will change me and turn me into a good Indian girl with long hair, with Indian dresses. But that didn't happen. And over a period of time, while struggling for finding my identity, I then developed paranoid schizophrenia. As we know, with the pathologization of psychiatry that has happened, the three words that I often use is consumerism, capitalism, and Christianity. And as Indians and as Asians, we are struggling to actually just decolonize our minds, you know, and decolonize our approach into how we're also supposed to sell this narrative. Because when somebody even has to ask me what my pronoun is, I am speechless, because there is a pressure to even have pronouns. Can't I just be a human being? So what the Red Door does is we started realizing that, or what I started realizing is creativity actually helped me live with the voices in my head, where one culture says that having voices in your head is something to not have. It is wrong that you have voices in your head and you need to be fixed. I started realizing that no amount of medications were working on me, and grateful enough I had a psychiatrist who backed me up in a way, and art started working for me. So as an artist, as a writer, as a mime artist, as a martial artist, I took that into the community, because no amount of rights was enough for me to be accepted in society. No amount of NGOs were creating awareness. Although we're talking about awareness, stigma still exists, let alone, I probably have to whisper the word sex. As a woman, as an Indian woman, as an Asian Indian woman, even in today's world, we are still living in a male-centric world, right? It's still that. A lot of the narratives are still very masculine in nature. To be more exact. On the other hand, there is a struggle in India where we are stuck between the Western ideologies that is necessary to our growth, but we're also stuck with the Indian patriarchal systems and the traditions. And what I started realizing was maybe that was a good thing, because there's a Hindi word called jugaad, spelled as Jugaad. It basically means, it describes a creative way in which limited resources can be used to solve problems. In other words, life hacks. And it's actually very centric to how the Indian mindset is, where you know, you come home and you hear your parents nagging at you, whether you're 6 years old, you're 16 years old, or you're 60, your parents are going to nag at you. And this is very much an Indian culture. Now, it does not happen in a country outside of India, especially a Western country. Children are told to leave home at the age of 18 and to become independent. So the struggle for identity here is so important. And where art comes in is art allows you to be flexible. Art has allowed a lot of people coming to us for support to explore themselves holistically. Although on one hand, that has been a challenge because there's also an additional to art-based therapy, which we don't actually promote from the Red Dot perspective. Because when you're saying art-based therapy, it means you still need to fix me. You still need somebody else to give me therapy in order for me to be fixed. And what we started doing is that just give a person a box of paints, or give them a blank sheet of paper, or give them a wall and just ask them to go crazy, go wild. And people were doing that. What we saw happening here was a change in how we started looking at ourselves. And therefore, when it also comes to the context of LGBTQIA, it is to go back into a culture that has about 12,500 mother tongues and probably that many goddesses and gods that allow us to be a different way. So the intermingling or the intersection here is between the culture, the spirituality and the religious context of how we can see ourselves through our own eyes, through our own narratives, and not somebody else doing it for us. And that, hey, you know, I can be an alien today, I can be a vampire tomorrow, I can be the goddess tomorrow if I want to. Not because the culture says that if you're an Asian Indian woman, you either are a goddess or you either are a vamp. And that too is a construction and a preconceived notion that we're still struggling to fight with. On the other hand, it's looking at the community level. So for the past 5 years, I personally actually teach kids in the community in India. These are high violent background communities where you might see a kid that is probably strangling his friend, and I have to physically separate them. You have girls punching each other. It's to a lot of high levels of violence. And what started happening at this stage when mental health started booming, because we have larger amounts of NGOs in this country than we have hospitals. So mental health started entering schools, and sadly enough, psychologists were diagnosing this population of kids, saying that they are probably having a psychiatric disorder. And we must bear in mind that psychiatric medications do a lot of damage to the body and to the hormones when you start early. Although I started late on them and I left them, it has left its impact on my body and my brain. And we're forgetting that. So what we started seeing with creativity and with the community or the underprivileged or the lower strata communities in India versus the privileged community is, the privileged community have their own struggles, and our struggles can be expressed through English. Whereas these guys from the different community do not have the luxury of English, let alone the understanding. But the jugaad here, or the life hack here in just changing the word, is accepting that, hey, you know what, we're all mad. Or the Hindi word pagal, which means mad. The word psycho, for example, it's used very naturally and very casually in our conversations. And it's been quite for me as an activist who started in the beginning in 2004 to tell the world that, hey, don't call me psycho. In the last 5 years, I'm actually okay with people saying that I'm psycho. And that's important with why we're using creativity, because it's not so much about taking a paintbrush, it's really allowing your mind to get into creative thinking. And creative thinking is what allows us to actually be flexible in how we formulate who I am today, because we're constantly changing. As Jiddu Krishnamurti says, it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a sick society. As human beings, we have to sit and sell ourselves to other human beings and have these discussions, but I don't see animals doing that. So we are actually just fighting with each other for rights. Where creativity comes in is, it's just so open. It comes with the flow that allows you to just be who you are. There's no pressure of, am I drawing a straight line, or am I writing the D, backwards or in mirror image? Because if I'm able to write the D in mirror image, it just means I'm a really good artist. Also looking at how creativity in India, or let's say Bollywood and Hollywood and all of these cinema categories that we have, also says that being mad is okay. So on one hand, it does not mean to romanticize madness. That's not what the plan is with the work that we're doing. It's just to recognize that, hey, it's okay if you're mad, because each and every one of us is actually mad in the eyes of the other. Yet we're actually very unique in our own selves, and working in communities have taught me also how we are really all interconnected, we are interlinked. It's no more about the Western culture and the Eastern culture, because we are all actually influencing each other at so many different levels. So can that be a good thing? Can we borrow from another culture, and can the other culture borrow from us in how they're also interpreting their identities and experiences? Because I'm going to end it in what I've learned from an existential therapist who has been working for 50 years in psychiatric situations, is Professor M. Van Roosen, who says, when you see somebody who's behaving or behaving strangely, or probably stripping or winking or calling out names, or moving and jumping up the ladder, why do we try to bring them down the ladder? Why do we not ask ourselves, hey, what's making him do that? Yeah. And that is the curiosity that I think creativity allows all of us to do.
And thank you for that. I can't believe why am I not surprised we've gone over time, because, we've been given the second LGBTIQ side event at COSP, and there'll be many more to come. This is a demonstration that we need more activities, more events like this to happen. So I'm afraid we've run out of time. We don't have time for Q&A. So I know the organisation will be taking this on board and saying, what more can we do? Because there's so much for us to say. So first of all, I want to thank all the panelists. You were absolutely amazing. And I also wanted to thank the organisers and the interpreters. But more importantly, before I leave and before we leave today, it's the importance of self-care, the importance to stop us from burning out activists. If you're triggered in any way from anything that you've heard in the side event, please reach out and get support. Reach out to ILGA World or myself if you're keen to be part of a global LGBTI disability network, which I can see is going to happen. And I just wish we had more time. Thank you, everybody, for giving up your time. Wherever you are in the world, more conversation like this is going to happen. Thank you.